My name is Elizabeth Karcher. I'm the executive director at the Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C. It is a historical site with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Tuesday Lunch and Learn speaker series. We had started this last spring as a result of COVID. We had intended to do these talks at the house, but of course, under COVID, we've moved to an online virtual platform, and we have had tremendous success over the last almost a year that we've been doing this. Today's speaker, I think today is number 20 in the session, so that is really terrific that this has taken off as much as it has. This is brought to you by generous donations from sponsors who have made this possible for the Wilson House to have the speaker series. So we thank our sponsors, and we let you know that we have speakers every Tuesday and every second Tuesday and fourth Tuesday of the month through June. We will have the speaker series continue, which is really terrific. At the end of the presentation today, I'll give you the list of who's coming up next, so you can mark your calendars. While the museum is closed for tours inside the museum, we do have walking tours of the neighborhood. So while we're closed for tours, we are open for walking tours of the neighborhood. So now that the weather is getting good, please go to our site, our website, and download the walking tour. We've got one on Kalorama and the historic buildings that are just around Kalorama neighborhood, starting and ending at the Wilson House. It takes about an hour, and you'll see about 20 stops along the way about the history of Kalorama and some of the historic buildings, the embassies, and people who've lived there. We also have a Waddy Butler Wood walking tour. It's called If These Walls Could Talk, and it's about the buildings that were the famous architect Waddy Butler Wood designed and built in the neighborhood, and of course the famous people who lived in those houses as well. So download those tours and take them today. We are also open for virtual tours. If you've got a group that's looking to do a virtual tour, we're happy to give a virtual tour online like this. So have you or your guests call us, and we'll set that up. So without any further ado, I'm going to get started on today's talk. We have welcomed, I was fascinated, and I need to thank Louise Shelley, because Dr. Louise Shelley, she introduced me to Dr. LaNitra Berger. Dr. LaNitra Berger is an award-winning scholar, educator, and social justice advocate working towards making higher education accessible to low-income, first-generation, and minority students. Her scholarly interests are in art and social activism in the African and Jewish diasporas. For over 15 years, her work as an educator focuses on creating and expanding education abroad and opportunities for underrepresented students, particularly in international education. As a social justice advocate, she supports student activism by teaching, advising, speaking, and supporting students. Dr. Berger is the author of Exploring Education Abroad, a guide for racial and ethnic minority participants, and the monograph, Irma Stern and the Racial Paradox of South African Modern Art, Audacities of Color, which just recently came out in December. She is also the editor of Social Justice and the International Education Research Practice and Perspectives. So today's title is Irma Stern and the Racial Paradox of South African Modern Art, the Audacities of Color. Dr. Berger is a senior director at the Office of Fellowships and the Office of Undergraduate Education, affiliate faculty of African and African American Studies program at George Mason University. Dr. Berger will also has had a student who attended one of her summer abroad programs that we mentioned there. Her name is Nutesh Felazor, and she will be interviewing Dr. Berger during this talk today. So with that, I welcome Dr. Berger.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this invitation and for the opportunity to speak to your guest today. I'm so thrilled to be able to talk about this book and the issues surrounding the book today. I also want to thank your donors for supporting this series and the kind of dialogue that people so dearly need right now during COVID. So I really appreciate the support of your donors. And I also want to thank Dr. Louise Shelley for the introduction because I really admire the work that you're doing at the Woodrow Wilson House. I think it's very important. It's much needed, and I think it serves a really important need in our community right now. So thank you for all that you're doing to broaden our knowledge and understanding of the complexities of Woodrow Wilson as president. Um, I am so excited to talk about this book today because I feel like so much of Irma Stern's life is connected directly to what we're discussing in the headlines today. So, conversations about women artists, their roles in society, conversations about cancel culture, and conversations that are very hard conversations about how to handle people who have complex racial views. And Irma Stern fits into all of those categories. I've been working on this book for well over 20 years. So when I started this book in 1999, the apartheid had recently ended in South Africa. No one was talking about Confederate monuments or memorials or taking them down. And no one was really talking more frankly about the role of women artists in the art history canon. This was all new territory. And I'm so pleased that over the last 20 years, as I've been writing this book, these conversations have become more and more important, both in my discipline field of art history, but also in the general public realm. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about the book, about some of the themes, and give you a sense of who Irma Stern was. And then one of my favorite and best students, Nutesh Velazor, is here to do an interview. And I want to give credit to Elizabeth for coming up with this idea. Elizabeth is also really committed to supporting students and giving them voices and chances to be elevated. And so Nutesh studied abroad with me in South Africa. So she's actually been to the Irma Stern Museum. She's seen Irma Stern's work. And so I want to have just a brief conversation with her about the book and her thoughts before we turn it over to Q&A. So please, if you have questions, type them into the Q&A. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Irma Stern, on the broader conversations that we're having, and really have a great discussion. So with that, I'm going to get started. My book has several themes that I was trying to piece together in studying this artist. I came upon Irma Stern's work by accident. I was looking for a seminar topic in graduate school, and there was an auction catalog from South Africa that had fallen on the floor and literally opened up to the page with an Irma Stern painting on it. It was a painting of a Black woman, and it was fascinating. I was captivated by it. So when I looked at the painting and I looked at her name, I thought, this is interesting. And I traced back some of her biography and realized how complex she was and how interesting she was and how interesting her work was. So this project began as, a seminar paper, and it slowly became a book project. So I'm looking at a couple of different things in the book. I'm trying to understand how global modernism was when we think about modern art, how global it was even before we were talking about globalism or globalization. Irma Stern traveled throughout the world throughout her life by boat before airplanes. So she was in contact with people of all different cultures and all different places at a time when we don't typically think of people being that connected to other parts around the world. She was also extremely influenced and part of a robust Jewish community in South Africa that I'll talk about. And the crux of this conversation today is I want to talk to you about the relationship between Irma Stern, Jan Smuts, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa and one of the architects of apartheid, and Woodrow Wilson. So this is a talk for the Woodrow Wilson House, and he has his own complex relationship to both international relations and to domestic race relations. And so I'm going to make that connection for you today. And then I'm going to transition into talking about how the apartheid system impacted Stern's work. And then finally, how do we look at Stern today? How do we think about an artist who at the same time built her career painting Black and colored or mixed race South African women, but didn't believe that they should be equal? How do we think about people like that? And I would put Woodrow Wilson in that same category. So we're going to talk about that at the end. This is a photograph of Irma Stern as a young woman, and this is an example of one of the paintings she did in the 20s after she had established herself as an artist in South Africa. So Stern was born in 1894 and she died in 1966. Those dates are really important because it means that she lived through some of the most consequential political and social movements of the 20th century. She was alive during the Boer War. She was alive during World War I, World War II. Her family survived the Holocaust, and she was alive for the first 20 years of apartheid in South Africa. So she saw a lot during her time as an artist, and she was constantly struggling to piece together her understanding of the world and put it into artistic terms. So this is a classic example of an Irma Stern painting. It was of a Pondo woman, which is one of the Black ethnic groups in South Africa. I like to put up a picture of Stern as a baby for a couple of reasons. One, you can see that even as a young child, she was born into a relative wealth in South Africa. Her parents had immigrated from Germany to South Africa in the 19th century, and they established a general store that served some of the mining areas in South Africa. And I think that it's interesting to get a sense of the type of privilege that she had early on. But I like this picture for another reason. I like it because it also shows that Stern was in contact with people of different races and cultures from the time she was a baby. And that was unusual globally, but also unusual for someone of her age level and status. So that, I think, really sets the tone for who she was. For those of you who are not very familiar with South Africa, I always put a map up so that you can get a sense of the geography of the country. Stern was born in an area called the Transvaal, which is in the northeastern part of the country, outside of Johannesburg and Pretoria. But most of her life and her home were in Cape Town, which is about 700 miles to the southwest of Johannesburg on a peninsula that faces the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. So she went back and forth quite a bit between the two places, but most of her life and her work was concentrated in the Cape Town area. So Stern, after the Boer War, her family fled and they went back to Germany, where she had the opportunity to be immersed in German culture. She was very fond of German theater. She went to the opera. She went to classical music concerts. She read widely. And because of World War I, her family had to stay in Germany. They could not return to South Africa. So they spent World War I in Germany. And for the first time in her life, she saw some of the political fallout of war and its impact on everyday people. And one day she saw a young girl on a tram, and she felt that the girl was all alone and that this was a result of the war. So she painted this image that you see here called Eternal Child. And she spoke specifically about how this work was a response to the war's effect on children. And this became one of the first works that she created as an artist, where she was describing how social events and social elements could influence people, and how she could depict social themes in her work. And this will become very important later on in her life. She was able to show this painting to a very influential German expressionist artist named Max Pechstein. And some people who are familiar with modern art know Max Pechstein. And Pechstein was a famous German expressionist artist. and he was a leader in socialist causes in Germany. Not only that, Pechstein also loved to travel. He received money from his gallery dealer to travel to Palau, which is an island in the South Pacific, and he was able to live and paint there until the war ended. Palau was a German colony. And so Pechstein was very interested in Stern because she also loved to travel, because she was a young up and coming artist, and because she was interested and had been exposed to people of different backgrounds, more specifically Black and African people through her upbringing in South Africa. And so Pechstein decided to sponsor her. He introduced her to his gallery dealer, Wolfgang Gerlit, and Gerlit also supported Stern's work in addition to Pechstein's. And in this image, you see there's a photograph of Pechstein, but there are also two images of Pechstein's work. And once you take a look at this, you'll start to see some of the similarities and influences that Stern had from her connection with Pechstein. Pechstein did work in Palau, as I mentioned, and he visited ethnographic museums in Berlin and did lithographs and other drawings of African sculpture. So Stern's appeal to him was that she had actually been one of the few people who was known in Berlin who had spent a lot of time in Africa with African people. The other German expressionists were only looking at examples of African art in ethnographic museums. So they developed a lifelong correspondence, a lifelong relationship where they influenced each other, where they did drawings for each other, where Pechstein told Stern that she needed to work hard to become as well known as an artist as possible. So Stern decided to return to Cape Town in 1920 and establish herself as an artist. She was not married at the time. It was very difficult for women to be independent. The Cape Town art scene was very conservative. It was male dominated and it was Christian. So she had a very hard time breaking through as a Jewish woman artist. And she was finally able to get some traction in Cape Town by becoming more active in Cape Town's Jewish community. So I have these two images up here because I want you to see the difference between the type of work that Stern was creating in the 20s for a primarily European audience. The drawing, the lithograph on my left, is one that Stern did for a European audience. It's called Duma la Morena. It's very abstract. It's supposed to represent her impressions of Africa for an audience who has no real understanding of the African continent. The image on my right is called Three Swazi Women. And Stern was able to travel throughout South Africa, visiting and embedding herself in Black communities. And this is an example of a painting that she did when she went to Swaziland. And it's very different when she's painting and drawing images for a South African audience, people who are very familiar with the different cultures in that country. So there's a big disconnect between the type of work she's doing for Europeans and the type of work she's doing for South Africans. So as I mentioned, Stern was deeply involved in the Jewish community, and she had two friends who supported her throughout her life and really helped drive her career and drive her to be successful in South Africa. They were Rosa van Helderen, who you see on my left, and Hilda Pravitsky, who you see on my right. These are both Stern portraits that she did of these two women. They were lesbian life partners. They were educators. They ran an integrated school in Cape Town that educated girls who were colored girls or mixed race South African girls, and they were very progressive. They really prompted Stern and really all of the South African elite to think more carefully about what was the direction of modern art in South Africa. What would that look like, and how would that be different than what European modernism looks like? And to do this, they really drew on their Jewish values. So they believed that Jewish art in South Africa would not only depict Jewish subjects, but that it would also draw on the social themes of South Africa, that it would look at issues of race and racism and racial inequality. So they were really pushing Stern to continue doing the work that she was doing. And as you can see here, this is an image that Stern did in the 30s of a colored or mixed race girl. So you can see that she's very interested in looking at the cultural distinctions of different types of South Africans. And to do this, she had to travel to those areas. She had to go. South Africa was segregated. You know, even when it wasn't legally segregated, people of different races lived in different places. So she would have to go to those places in order to be able to paint people of different backgrounds. Now, Stern had another friend, a third member of the Jewish community named Richard Feldman, who was also influential in her work. Feldman was, his family had immigrated to South Africa from Russia. They were Yiddish speaking, and he was heavily involved in politics. And he decried the horrendous conditions under which Black people worked in the mines in South Africa. Many of them were dying on a regular basis because of the dangerous conditions, and they were poorly paid. And he saw this as an atrocity, and he believed that Stern's art could be a tool for humanizing Black people and for putting more of a human touch to this economic and racial struggle. And as you can see here, he actually published a book in Yiddish called Schwarz und Weiß. And this book spoke about the economic exploitation of Black people in the mines. And as you can see here, he used one of Irma Stern's paintings to illustrate that book. So all of this talk about Irma Stern really started to make the South African establishment outside of the Jewish community think more critically about embracing her and her legacy. People were very interested in the fact that Stern had traveled back and forth to Europe, so she had a lot of European credibility. She was exhibiting throughout Europe. She was in London and Paris and Zurich and Berlin. She was a well-known quantity in Europe. And as South Africa was trying to disassociate itself from its African geography and reconnect itself to some type of white culture, as they were trying to establish the principles of apartheid, Stern began to get more commissions, more government support, and a broader audience. So she became very wealthy. She became very well known in South Africa as a famous artist, and very well supported. So during World War II, she was unable to continue traveling back and forth from South Africa to Europe. And as someone who was not only very interested in meeting other people in other cultures, but she was also somebody who could not sit still. By this time, she had been married and divorced. She was completely independent and had her own art. She was living off of her art. So she decided to rent a car and drive from South Africa to what was then known as the Belgian Congo. And she traveled there. She again embedded herself into communities where she then drew and painted people. So she produced two travel narratives during that time. One was Congo, which she produced in 1942, and one was Zanzibar. And there's a drawing on my right that comes from the Zanzibar travel narrative that she produced in 1948. These are very interesting because, again, Stern is absorbing social themes. She's influenced by the Jewish community. She has, in the 40s, a lot of fame. She's well known and well connected in South Africa. And she goes to the Belgian Congo and she meets who she's aspiring to see as the Watusi queen, as she calls her. But she also notices that there are who she calls shorter and darker people called the Hutus, and she sees that there's a lot of tension between these two groups. Well, what she's actually observing and writing about is what will become the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. And one of the queens that she paints and describes in her travel narrative is the queen who was executed at that time. So again, Stern had this ability to understand that what she was understanding about the world politically and socially was also something that she should discuss artistically in her work. So by the time that Stern got back to South Africa after the war ended, apartheid had become the official policy of South Africa. And that meant that There was strict rules about racial segregation. There were strict rules about people traveling. It was very important to the South African regime that South Africans did not travel outside of the country. If they did, they might see that the system that they were now living under in South Africa was unjust and wrong. So it became much more difficult for regular South Africans to travel. The exception, though, was Stern. Stern became even more celebrated at this time. And that was because she was someone who painted Black women, she painted colored women. And the government realized that if they promoted this type of work through their embassies, through international exhibitions, that they could put a quote unquote softer side onto apartheid. They could say, look, we are supporting this woman artist, this Jewish female artist who's painting people of different races and backgrounds. How could apartheid be so bad? And so Stern received a lot of support, and including letters of transit from Jan Christian Smuts. Stern had a friendship with Jan Smuts. And the reason why Stern and Smuts got along so well is because Smuts was also an internationalist. He was British educated. He also supported the League of Nations, and he was inspired and connected to President Woodrow Wilson. They had a shared goal in getting the League of Nations implemented. And Smuts was also deeply racist. So even though he promoted internationalism against the policy goals of apartheid, he still believed in his heart and core that Black people were inferior. And so I see a lot of parallels between Wilson and Smuts because they both had this extraordinarily international outlook and this idea that nations should interact and work together. But domestically, they believed in extremely draconian policies towards Black people. Stern fits in that mold as well. She spent so much time traveling. She had so much support from the government. She spent so much time with people who looked different than her, even though she was supported by the government to do this. But she still, in her core, also believed in segregation. So this was really something that was very difficult for Stern to reconcile. She wanted to be with Black people. She wanted to be part of Black culture, but she had a very difficult time accepting that Black people were in fact equal. On multiple occasions, she decried the lack of a color bar. For example, she wanted there to be segregation. She did not want to share water fountains with Black people, but of all the artists, she had the most contact with them. So I think it's really interesting that she had a relationship with Jan Smuts, that Smuts supported her travel, that they both shared this interest in branching out to other cultures and understanding other cultures, while at the same time feeling that they wanted to maintain segregation and white supremacy in South Africa. So during the apartheid period, Stern had much more trouble visiting areas where people of color lived, where Black and colored people lived. And she started to see a change in their reception of her. And these are images from that period. The image on my left is from the pre-apartheid period, but it's from the 1940s of a Xhosa woman, which is another South African ethnic group. And then you see what is also the cover of my book, this image of a maid in uniform that she did in the 50s. Stern very rarely painted images of women in urban settings. She was very interested in maintaining the idea that Black people really lived in rural environments, and she didn't want to discuss their urban connections. So she really struggled to connect and embed herself in these communities. So in the last 20 years of her life, she really spent more time traveling to Europe. She was in poor health, and so she spent a lot of time convalescing. But it was very difficult for her to reconcile the effect of the domestic policies of South Africa on the way that she wanted to paint people, the way that she believed that Black people should be painted. So in our post-apartheid era, as we're trying to understand how an artist like Irma Stern should be considered, this is going to lead me to bring Nutesh Felazor to the stage so that she and I can have a discussion about this. You know, in a post-apartheid environment where Black people are the majority and they are in power, a lot of young Black people who were born after apartheid ended, they're known as the born free generation. And even though so much has changed politically for Black people, not much has changed economically. They still have a hard time accessing education and economic opportunities and jobs. And so the younger generation is asking, if apartheid is over, if I was never living during apartheid, how is it that I still experience poverty? How is it that I still can't get an education? And so they have really started to question not only the political and economic issues, but also how these symbols and these artists that have been elevated all of these years, how that contributes to feelings of economic and social inferiority. So in 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall movement started, and that was the political effort to bring down the statues of Cecil John Rhodes that were placed throughout South Africa. And that prompted a social movement as well, where the students were asking for better access to education, better resources. So all of this took place while I was teaching in South Africa, and Nutesh, who's in the UC, we went to South Africa to study all of these issues and questions, and to think about what would be the legacy of an artist like Irma Stern. How do we think about artists like this? How do we reconcile an artist's life and their work? And how do we need to throw these artists out completely, or do we need to be rigorous in our thinking and add context and contextualize who they are? So that concludes my part of the presentation, and now I'll bring Nutesh up so that we can have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berger. That was a beautiful presentation. So my first question for you is it possible to separate an artist from their work?
That's a great question. This is really part of the core of what I've been studying with Stern. How do you separate the artist's biography from what they do on the page? I don't think that it's possible. I don't think that it's possible for artists or reasonable for us to think that artists create in a vacuum, that what they're experiencing personally and professionally, socially and politically, that doesn't seep into who they are and what they're doing. And I think that you can really see this with Stern. She's really trying to wrestle with her deep connections and interactions with individuals, with the prevailing theories and themes of racism and apartheid later in her life. So I think it's difficult and almost impossible for those two things to be separated. What I think we should be doing as scholars and as citizens is really accepting and leaning into this idea rather than try to resist it. Let's think about what makes those complexities so important and what we can learn from them.
Right. Thank you. So before we move on to the next question, we have a question in the chat. Isabel asks, is there any record of how the people who sat for her perceived her, and how did she treat them?
Thank you, Isabel, for asking that question. So unfortunately, I did not find a lot of records of how Stern treated her Black and colored subjects. So in art history, there's a big difference in how we define what a portrait is, versus a study, or as they were pejoratively called back then, native types. And that's typically associated with whether or not there's an actual name. As you saw when I showed you pictures of the portraits that she did of her Jewish friends, they're clearly identifiable and they have names associated with them. But the images that she did of Black women were often titled Pondo woman, Swazi woman, or Malay girl when she painted colored girls. And that, is one of those awful relics of that time when a Black or brown person's humanity was not accorded to them in the ways that you would bestow that on somebody for whom you were painting a portrait. So I don't think that she took the time to document that. Um, in her travel narratives in the Congo, you see a little bit more of that kind of documentation because she's painting queens and royalty. But on a regular basis, you don't see that distinction for her Black and brown artistic subjects.
And that's really interesting that you bring up the examples of the types of people that she drew. So I was looking at your book cover, and that portrait is beautiful. But I want to ask, what made you choose that specific photo for your book cover?
I love that question because this is actually my favorite Stern painting. I love this painting. I think it's beautiful. It hangs in the Irma Stern Museum in Cape Town, which is a beautiful museum, and I highly encourage you to visit if you ever go to Cape Town. I did my field research there, and I sat near this painting almost every day. And I was just so intrigued and in love with the subject itself because I believe this woman is so beautiful, but it also resonated for me personally. My grandmother was a domestic worker in Alabama, so I come from a long line of Black women for whom this was the only career option for them. I've also, if anybody is a Black person who's been on the receiving end of one of the look on that woman's face, that also looked very familiar to me as well. Like there's something so familiar to me about this woman, even though the title is Made in Uniform and we don't know much about who she was. So I wanted this painting in particular to foreground a Black woman on the cover, and to choose one of the more the least traditional of Irma Stern's works for the cover. The other reason was that I was finishing up this book in 2020, and there were so many examples of Black women being degraded, being murdered, being disrespected, and this was happening in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. And I really wanted this book to be something that was different, that really gave them some level of voice and agency that was not accorded to them at the time that these works were created. And that's why I have a picture of Breonna Taylor here as well, because I really felt that this was an opportunity to talk more about those women who Stern painted and give some more depth to who they were.
I love that. Okay, so my last question is, Irma Stern's house is in a museum in Cape Town, like you previously mentioned. So my question is, how does the museum specifically address her legacy? How does it do that justice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is another chance for me to make this connection back to what Elizabeth is doing at the Woodrow Wilson House. So the Irma Stern Museum has been a museum since 1971. And it's her house. And so you do get a sense of how she lived and all of the different things that she valued and enjoyed in her life by visiting her house. And I think that's fantastic. But the house, it has a gallery on the top floor that oftentimes features the work of Black artists. But it's only been recently that there's been a new director who's really been interested in responding to the student concerns of the Rhodes Must Fall movement and thinking about how to open this museum up to the community even more. And how to change the narrative of Irma Stern's story in a way that recognizes the ways in which she marginalized Black people who she also benefited from, but also, you know, allows people to feel a sense of ownership of the museum and the work that's in it. And so they are currently in that process right now. They are going through a process of redesigning the museum collection, redesigning the way that it's installed, redesigning the narrative that is told. And so I'm pleased that that's a very diverse constituency of different stakeholders who are doing that work. And I see also that Elizabeth and the Woodrow Wilson House are doing something similar. The ways that we've talked about Woodrow Wilson as president have been one-dimensional. We have not fully reckoned with or acknowledged the ways in which Woodrow Wilson actively prevented Black people from advancing in the civil service and advancing as people in the United States. And this is an important part of our history that we all need to recognize, that we all need to acknowledge. And a house museum is a fantastic place to do that kind of work. It's such an intimate setting to be in someone's house and really understand where they saw their personal retreat and you know the books that they read, as you can see in Elizabeth's background. You can see Irma Stern's library. What were their influences? This is really such an excellent place for us to go and do that very complex work of trying to reconcile someone's very competing views, that it's possible for someone to be artistically talented and genius and racist, that it's possible for a US president to have a sense of vision of how the United States should operate in the world while discriminating and subjugating against other American citizens. These are very complex dynamics that will take us decades to really be able to sit with. But I'm glad that we're finally starting down that path.
Thank you so much. Those are all of my questions. So now I guess we're going to go to the chat to see if we have any more questions. So we don't, but if anybody has any questions, this is now our Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in the chat.
I do have a question. That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Berger, and thank you, Nitesh, as well. That was terrific. Wonderful job interviewing. I like that you created this dynamic for when you were an exchange student and were able to do this with Dr. Berger. One of the things, first of all, I think Irma Stern is now my new favorite artist. Frankly, I didn't really know her that well. But when I see this, there's this a fascination and appreciation for the beauty in the people that she's painted. And so I see that, I can see it, and I don't feel, and my question to you is, do you feel that there's a sense among the African-American community, South African community, that they were somehow exploited by it because she doesn't use their names? Do you feel that that was, there's a level of disrespect because although they are beautiful and she's fascinated with with them, that she hasn't recognized them by name or only by their region?
Yeah, I'm so glad that one, that you're interested in Irma Stern now, and two, because you asked this question. This was really a uniquely difficult position that I was in as a Black scholar. So when I got to South Africa, I started doing the research for the book, and I floated between white scholarly communities and Black scholarly communities. And there's some overlap, but not much. Mm-hmm. And I found that I was a go-between. And when I was with the predominantly white community, there was a lot of love for Irma Stern and her legacy. But in the Black community, she is not liked, Black women in particular. but also the huge scholarly imbalance that tilts towards Irma Stern. So most places outside of the United States, women artists really struggle to get recognition. But there are several major white South African female artists who have a lot of attention in South Africa, and Irma Stern is one of them. And so many of the Black scholars, rightly so, are saying, you know, enough about Irma Stern. There's so many books in South Africa written about Irma Stern, so many exhibitions about Irma Stern. What about the Black artists? What about Black women artists? They have not been given the same scholarly attention. And I agree with that. I, for one, will probably not write another book about Irma Stern. But I think that there's a way for us to both acknowledge that and encourage that scholarship that is sorely needed for Black artists, while also recognizing the unique role that Stern played in both advancing a modern art discussion globally and at the same time disrespecting Black female subjects. So one other thing I'll say, though, that's interesting that I found in my research was that in the United States, scholar, philosopher, and critic Alain Locke, who wrote The New Negro in the 1920s, he discovered Stern while he was in Berlin, and he was also inspired by her work. And he actually encouraged African American modern artists in the 20s and 30s to look to Irma Stern as an example of someone who was painting Black people in a more humane way. So it's so layered and complicated because she was so global. In South Africa, there's a big racial divide in how she's perceived. In America, she's virtually unknown now, but in the 30s, she was seen as someone who was almost progressive. So it's really interesting to see how she's received in all these different geographic locations.
Do you think in part that's because we're layering on today's sensibilities and today's values on how we're judging her? I mean, I think that's part of it.
I think that this is, frankly, this is the question of the decade for us. Is, you know, at what point do we say that people are humane now? They are human beings, but they were also human beings at that time as well. And so, you know, a lot of the justification of Stern as progressive in South Africa is that, well, she was a product of her time, and that is how we saw people. So we shouldn't judge her by today's standards. But Irma Stern, as I mentioned in the talk, she had more exposure to people of different backgrounds than almost any other South African. She was a avid participant in the Jewish community in South Africa, who were also disproportionately anti-apartheid activists. So her own friends pushed her and encouraged her and criticized her when she made racist remarks. So even for somebody of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, she had access to more information to form different opinions and to do different things. And she still chose the route of, you know, not documenting people and not giving them their humanity. So I think that the archives and her biography really speak to us judging her by a different standard because of that.
Thank you.
And we have another question in the chat. Jackie asks, even though Irma was trained in the European sense of art, is there any influence of African art or artists in Irma's art?
Thanks, Jackie. That's a great question. So yes. So Irma Stern, you know, was heavily influenced by Expressionism, but she also, you know, was definitely influenced by Black African artists, by African design, South African sense of design. Her house is filled with an extensive collection of African art and African sculpture, which she also painted herself. And she She loved Kuba textiles, which are the textiles that come from Central Africa. And Nitesh took my African art class as well, so she probably remembers the Kuba textiles. So there were so many influences from the African continent. One funny story about Stern is that she loved Zanzibar when she visited. She visited Zanzibar multiple times. So in addition to taking a boat back and forth to Europe, driving on her own to Central Africa, she also took a boat to Zanzibar and traveled there and loved Stone Town. She loved the carved wooden sculptures. And she took pieces of buildings back with her and used them to make frames for her paintings. And she actually took a very large set of beautiful carved wooden doors from Zanzibar and installed them in the front door of her house. So it was illegal. She was stealing cultural property. But that just shows you how keen her eye was for design and beauty in whatever culture she was visiting.
Thank you. And Dr. Berger, I actually have a question. Thinking back to when I visited South Africa and like here listening to this discussion, and Elizabeth's question about exploitation, that brought me to think about the concept of appropriation. Do you know how others felt in the Black community in South Africa and other parts of Africa that Irma went to? And kind of, because you in the presentation, you said she didn't just visit, she like immersed herself into their community and in their culture. And thinking about like today's values and our culture and society, if, a white person enters into a Black community, it's thought of as kind of removing space from other Black people. So how do you think about her activism in that sense?
I'm glad you raised this point. So I think there's a fine line, and I think it shifts over time. What I would say about Stern is that there was much more of an interaction in her earlier years. What I didn't say earlier was that Stern was overweight for most of her life, and she was very self-conscious about her personal appearance. And so she felt judged by people in Cape Town because of that. And I believe that when she went to paint in Black communities, she was never judged for her appearance. She was welcomed in the teens and 20s. And it was an escape for her to go to a place where she was accepted. And I think that was very much part of why she felt connected to those communities. Later on, I think there was less of a reciprocity going on. I think that she knew that this type of work was lucrative and that it was part of her brand, as we say today. I think her views had hardened as she got older. So I think that there was much more of a line. But about 15 years ago, when I was at the Irma Stern Museum, one of the workers there, a Black woman, I asked her what she thought about these paintings, and she said, a lot of people do say that Irma Stern exploited these women, but she had a different take on it. Basically, she said that because apartheid had separated so many people from their ancestral roots because they were forced to live in cities, she said that some of the Irma Stern paintings were some of the only examples that she saw of what her ethnic culture looked like before apartheid. And I thought that was interesting. I thought that was something that has stuck with me all of these years since, that this woman who worked in the Irma Stern Museum, saw Irma Stern's work all the time, still felt that there was something valuable to be gained from the work that she did. So I think that we have to evaluate her differently over the long course of her life. She painted for almost 60 years. And, there are times when I think there was a more of an exchange, and there are definitely times when I think she was taking more than she was giving back.
I have to add that on our social media, we don't put out a lot of social media. We're a very slim team and slim staff, but we did promote your talk today. And I have over 700 likes on this talk. And they're all mostly coming from South Africa. And so there's definitely an audience. There's definitely people who are, and I think the reason they're not doing it is because it's probably midnight for them right now. So for those of you who are missing or want to hear this talk again, it will be going on our YouTube. And for those in South Africa, I'm going to load it up for them to be able to hear it. And I get a sense from the people who are responding that there is this appreciation for this art, and that yes, there are problems with it, and yes, there are problems with Irma Stern, but the people are able to see themselves in the art that she created, and so that's a good thing. I think that also ties to the Woodrow Wilson House, as you pointed out, and the things that we're doing. Yes, there are things that are unacceptable, and that is not who we are today, that we see in the history of Woodrow Wilson, and yet it's something that we still come back to learn about, and to have our own self growth through learning about the mistakes and the missteps, the mistakes, and the consequential legacy that Woodrow Wilson has left behind. So with that, I thank you. Do we have any other questions in the chat? If not, I'll give a heads up of our speakers and our thanks. On the second and fourth Tuesdays of each month, we'll have notable historians, curators, and leaders explore the social movements of the early 20th century and their relevance today. And I think we saw that with Dr. Berger and Dr. Berger's talk today. Our talks explore women's suffrage, activism, protests, racial inequality, and the consequences and legacies of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The Woodrow Wilson House Tuesday Speaker Series is brought to you through generous donations from Carrie Fuller, Nancy Bliss, Ed Gerber, and Christopher Keller. So register now for our upcoming series. We have on Tuesday, March 23rd, will be the Korean Cultural Center and the Dana Tysoon Burgess Dance Company will be making a presentation on Korean immigration, and that'll be through the expression of modern dance, which I'm looking forward to that. For those of you who don't know, Dana Tysoon Burgess is the official choreographer for the Smithsonian, and we're very lucky to have him on our advisory council as well. So I'm looking forward to that collaboration with the Korean Cultural Center on March 23rd. We have big news because we have Rebecca Boggs Roberts is actually going to be the biographer for Edith Wilson. And Rebecca Boggs Roberts, along with Heath Hardage Lee, are discussing Edith Wilson, brave, beautiful, and complicated. And that talk will take place on Tuesday, April 13th. If you saw the Smithsonian Channel, Heath Lee was just on Madam President, which was recorded just recently at the Woodrow Wilson House about Edith Wilson, and the talk about whether she was actually Madam President during the time that Woodrow Wilson had a stroke or not. So hearing those two women talk about Edith Wilson will be really fascinating. And then we have on Tuesday, April 27th, I have from Dr. Philip Zieglau from the University of Virginia. He's going to be talking about his book that is just published this month called The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War, 1916 to 1917, and the work that Woodrow Wilson did to help end the war. So those are the upcoming for March and for April. I hope that you'll be able to join us. I thank you, Dr. LaNitra Berger, thank you. And Nutesh Belazor, thank you both very much for joining us. And to our audience, thank you. Tell your friends to log on. This will be on our Zoom channel, on our YouTube channel coming up. And I will text it out to all of our friends in South Africa so they can get to see this as well. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.